Hi friends, welcome back to my channel. My name is Taylor and today's video is going to be all the books that I read in the month of April. If this is your first time watching a video from me, welcome. If you already are subscribed to my channel, I did have several dedicated reading vlogs for some of these books, so be forewarned, especially if you've watched all of my reading vlogs, that I will be talking about some of the same books that I've been talking about for the whole entire month. But without further ado, let's get into my wrap-up. I read 11 books this month, which was very exciting and nice. Last month I read 6 books. Only one of them was really worth mentioning in any capacity, unfortunately. That's just the way it is sometimes. I was also dealing with a new normal, so wasn't a great reading month. This month got a whole lot better. So lucky and so privileged enough to be able to stay home, and I have just been getting a lot of good reading in. I did read a lot of audiobooks. Out of the 11 books I read this month, 6 of them were on audio. That's also because I played a whole lot of Animal Crossing this month, and for me it's really nice to be able to listen to an audiobook while I play Animal Crossing. So that's why there are so many audiobooks on here, but I think this is the first month in a while that it has been like a 50-50 split between physical reading and audiobook reading, which is really nice because I have really been enjoying getting into physical reading again now that I have more time at home. So let's get into the books. This video is going to be very rough to edit because I don't have physical copies of almost all of them. So first book that I read this month, which seems like forever ago, is This Is How You Lose the Time War, and this book was so good. I read it as an audiobook, which I think takes a very certain type of person to enjoy the audiobook because you're not really supposed to understand what's going on. This is very heavy sci-fi. It's I believe it's novella length, about 2 warring agents on a time war. They start leaving letters back and forth to each other on their different missions, and they start cultivating rivalry, turns to a friendship, turns into a beautiful love story, and really those focuses and that love is the focus of this story. It's heavy sci-fi that's never explained, so you don't really know what's going on other than the passion and the feeling that red and blue feel for each other. So I really thought this was great as an audiobook. I thought it was great escapism. You're really not thinking about anything other than the beautiful prose in this book. However, for some people who are trying to make sense of what is going on, perhaps reading it physically would be a better choice for you, because there were several points where I had to stop the audiobook and think about what was happening because it does get a little confusing, but I don't think the point of this book is to understand the complexities of the world and the complexities of like the technology or even who Red and Blue are as characters, because they're definitely not human, but I don't know what they are because it's never explained. So this is very fantastical and it's very short and it's a really good escapist read, which I know a lot of people are looking for right now. The next book I read was Perfect Murder, Perfect Town by Lawrence Schiller. I listened to this on audiobook as well. This book is about the tragic JonBenet Ramsey case and kind of the investigation into that. All I'll say on this one is that unless you're completely brand new and you've never even heard of this case before, I would probably advise skipping this book just because there wasn't like a lot of new information. It was a book that was pretending to be non-biased and look into all of the different angles of what could have happened, and then it turned out being very biased at the end. There were some good insights and interviews, but really, especially if you're a fan of true crime or if you've heard of this tragic case before, you've already heard all of it and in probably like a less biased way. I'd say there are better ones out there, but this was a really decent audiobook production, so I would say probably skip this one unless you really want to be like a completionist about the case and read every single book on it, because I do believe Lawrence Schiller was involved in the case in some way. I think he was like a reporter or a private investigator. I don't know. This book was forgettable, so I don't remember a lot. The next book I read this month was The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. I also listened to this on audiobook because my copy is annotated from high school, and that's just a little annoying to read because if I were to annotate this, I would annotate it differently than what we were supposed to look for in high school. So I did get the audiobook on Audible. Jake Gyllenhaal does an amazing job. This is kind of like a tragic love story, also just an exploration of old money versus new money in New York in the 1920s. So it's a classic. It's one of my favorite classics. I would highly recommend it to anyone who is looking to kind of jump into classics because it is a very short book. I did read this for the OWLS Magical Readathon, which I did complete, by the way, so that's really exciting. And this was my prompt for a short book, so it is very short. The writing style isn't too complex, and it's just got like some beautiful quotes and some beautiful prose in here as well. So highly recommend you picking it up if you are looking for a classic. If you don't mind sad endings and unlikable characters, but you really enjoy beautiful writing, this is probably a good classic to pick up for you. The next book, I actually read this one physically, but then I loaned it to my mom to read, and that is Valentine by Elizabeth Wetmore. This is a debut novel that definitely doesn't read like one. This is literary fiction about a small town in 1970s Texas. And at the beginning of this book, a young woman is raped, and the whole book goes through, I believe, 4 or 5 different women's perspectives and sort of the town in general as they react to kind of what happened, because the young girl in question is a daughter of a Mexican undocumented immigrant, and the man who committed this offense, he is very respectable and liked in the community, and he's white. It goes through some gender issues, it goes through also some racial issues as well, and how they intersect. This is a very hard book. There are a lot of trigger warnings, including domestic abuse, both physical and mental, suicide, rape. There's a lot. Definitely look into those before you pick this up if you are concerned about any of that. And it is a literary fiction book, so it is written very experimentally. There are multiple points of view that are being used, like first person, second person. There's a second person plural in there. And then also whenever the characters speak, there are no quotation marks. So I would recommend that you pick this up physically rather than audio, just because I think that it would get a little bit confusing with the way that it's formatted. So moving on to the next book, and that is Smoke Gets in Your Eyes by Caitlin Dougherty, and this is a novel and kind of like autobiography of her time working in the American funeral industry. I have read another book by her that I enjoyed a little bit better than this one. I believe this was her first published book, and I think you can tell that like her writing only gets better, which obviously is really good for her. Just I probably should have read this one before I read the second one. And I would have liked it better because I liked the second book a lot better. It appealed to me. It talked about like the death industry in different cultures, and this one more focused on her own personal career goals. She does work as a mortician, and this details her early career and her early struggles during that time. So this is a very niche read that I wouldn't recommend to just anyone. I do really enjoy these as an audiobook too. She narrates them and does an amazing job. It talks about death, so there's no way around that. I wouldn't recommend it to everyone just because talking about cremation and burial and all of that can be very, very triggering for people, and it's just like not a pleasant thing to read about. So it was really good. I really did enjoy reading this one. If you're going to pick up just one book by her, I would probably say From Here to Eternity, the book that I was talking about that I read earlier on this year, was probably a little bit better for me just because it went into different cultural burial practices and standards, which I thought was really neat. So, and then we have my favorite read of this month, and I did a whole entire reading vlog about it, and I will leave it in the description below if you want to watch it, because I am going to keep this short. Otherwise, I could talk about it for about 30 minutes, which is what the vlog ended up being for this book, and that is The Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires by Grady Hendrix. Grady Hendrix can do no wrong at this point. When he is coming out with a new book, I see it and I buy it because I know I'm going to love it. I know his books are really well done horror that pay homage to the genre, that do something creative and new and fun and different every time, with characters that you just absolutely love and care for. And I think that's so important in horror, is having those characters that you care for. This book is set in the 90s, and Patricia Campbell and her friends have a book club where they read true crime novels where they can escape their lives of just being homemakers and wives and mothers, and they can read about these gory true crime stories. And then a strange man moves into a neighborhood, kids start disappearing, and they discover this strange man who they suspect might be a serial killer because they've read all the classics like The Stranger Beside Me from Anne Rule, and they start believing that he's not just a serial killer, he might be an entirely different breed of monster. I loved it. If you only pick up one book based on this recommendations video, based on this wrap-up, pick up this one. I love Grady Hendrix. He's one of my favorite horror writers, and he's very highly respected and highly hyped in the horror community, and I think that's for really good reason. I think that his books are really good for beginners to the horror genre, and they're also really good for people who've been reading horror for a long time. They're really well done books, and I love this one, and this is, I think, my favorite by his. that he's done. It's either this one or My Best Friend's Exorcism. They're tied for my favorite of his books, so highly recommend you check this out. Another wonderful book that I read this month was Circe by Madeline Miller. This is another book that I would highly recommend as like a good escapist read. This is, I know a lot of people describe it as slow-paced, and I think I'm coming to the conclusion that when I find a lot of people are talking about this book is really good, but it's really, really slow, then I gotta pick it up and read it because I love those kind of books. But warning, if you're not into that, this does start off slow. And this is a book about Circe. She's from the Odyssey. If you had to read that in school, you might remember her as the evil witch who turns men into pigs. I thought that was kind of cool then, but we weren't supposed to like her, so just kept on pretending to read the Odyssey like the rest of my class. And this is her story. But I will say, the part with Odysseus takes up a relatively short part of this book because I didn't read a lot of mythology other than what was assigned for me in class, unfortunately, and I think that's something that is coming to me now as an adult. I had a English teacher who absolutely ruined the concept of Greek mythology for us, unfortunately. So I just kind of assumed that I wasn't interested in it and I didn't like it, and just now I have really been wanting to dive into mythology, and I'm learning that I'm really liking a lot of it. And I mean, I think if you're a horror fan, you'll probably like at least a lot of Greek mythology. It's kind of messed up. And I really enjoyed Circe because it is kind of a tale of a woman who is involved with all these gods and heroes and just absolutely bonkers stuff that happens. I mean, the gods are so fickle, and just the way that they act is just, you know, it's just for them. It's just for them. And it's just on whims that they do things to men. And Circe is just so great. Like, she doesn't really have a great allotment in life. Her father is a god and her mother's a nymph, I believe. And she has to kind of figure out her place. She's very low on the totem pole in terms of gods and titans and all of that. So her trying to fight and navigate her place in a world that definitely is not predisposed to her succeeding was really cool, and I really enjoyed it. I felt like this was the best of mythology classic writing while feeling fresh, feeling fun, very immersive. Like, I loved it. I'm excited to pick up Madeline Miller's other book as soon as I can because this was really wonderful and really good read for right now if you're looking for an escapist read. A lot of messed up things kind of happen because that's just Greek mythology, the way it works, kind of dark. But I just never knew of Circe beyond the very brief little cliff note that we get in the Odyssey, and this is just really awesome seeing her as the star of her own story instead of like just stop on Odysseus's journey. The next book that I read this month is Monstrous Volume 1 by Marjorie Liu, and this is probably going to become one of my favorite graphic novel series. It's steampunk, feminist, high fantasy, Asian inspired, war, mythology, just all of those mushed together in a wonderful stew. The main character is a badass. She's not very likable at first, so you kind of have to work on that. So, you know, going into it, don't expect to love her even at first. She warms up to you. At least she warmed up to me a lot. But she's very unlikable. But she learns. She makes some friends and she learns. And I love that trope of reluctant people coming together and forming a band and realizing that they do care for each other. It's a great trope. It's in here. I love it. This is about a war between gods and monsters and humans and these kind of like demi-humans that are like half human, half animal. It's really cool, and everyone's fighting for supremacy over the world. Some are just fighting to live without prejudice, and it's really cool. The main character, she has a monster inside her, so she has to kind of learn how to balance that, and the relationship that she actually has with this monster is really cool. Like, it's not just some parasite, but it is a parasite in the way that it's kind of taking over her body, but neither of them really want that, so they're trying to struggle for like codependence of the same body. It's wild. I can't really explain it better than that. It's just wonderful and magical, and the artwork is stunning. Honestly, I would hang it up on my walls if I had a physical copy, which I'm highly contemplating getting because I did read it on my phone on Hoopla, and some of those it works really well. Some of those, this one, I really wish that I had like the physical copy so I could really appreciate the artwork. But yeah, highly recommend this one. It's awesome. The next book I read this month, I'm just gonna hold it up briefly and then put it down because it is hefty, and that is House of Earth and Blood by Sarah J Maas, the first book in the Crescent City series, and I enjoyed it. It was my first Sarah J Maas book that I've ever read, so it was good. It was more smutty than I prefer. I prefer very minimal romance in my fantasy, so those aspects were rather a lot. But I really did enjoy the world. It's very intriguing. The side characters, I mentioned this before in a vlog, like just before I started filming this, so I feel like I'm gonna repeat myself. The characters were really cool. I really enjoyed seeing like an urban fantasy almost with all of these mythical creatures. Like you have fairies and angels and demons and vampires and shapeshifters and just everything all mixed into one city. And there's a world too, but we focus on Crescent City. This book has to deal with Bryce, the main character. Her best friends were all tragically murdered 2 years ago. And you kind of see that happening in like the first 25 to 50 pages. And then fast forward to present time, that has happened 2 years ago, and they thought they caught the killer, and now there are more people being murdered in the same exact way that her friends were murdered. So she has to team up with a fallen angel to try and figure out who is causing these murders, because her friend was a really powerful wolf shifter, and like vampires and other really powerful things are being killed, so they think it is someone or something that is very powerful. But I did really enjoy this book a lot more than I thought I was going to. I just have a soft spot for really chunky fantasies. I do think this is a really good book to pick up right now, just because it is like 800 pages, so if you've got a lot of time to kill, which a lot of us do right now, then it's a really good way to fill some of that time with all 800 pages of it. And if you're unsure about the series on whether or not you want to give it a shot, I will say this is the first in a trilogy, but I think for the most part, I mean, there are some small little character threads that probably are going to continue on through the rest of the series, but the ultimate whodunit question is answered by the end of the book. So if you read it and you decide you don't want to continue on with the rest of the series, it wraps up really nicely book one for you. The next book was an audiobook, and that's The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo by Taylor Jenkins Reid. I really enjoyed this one. This isn't a genre that I normally would ever pick up. It's a historical fiction about kind of like a, I almost want to say like a Marilyn Monroe, I guess, sort of character in terms of mystique, if Marilyn Monroe was half Cuban and had lived a very long, full life. The premise is a young journalist is randomly, at least she thinks, randomly picked to listen to Evelyn Hugo finally do a tell-all about her Hollywood life. So historical fiction, not really something I normally pick up, but this book has gotten so much hype on BookTube, and I did really enjoy Daisy Jones and the Six. And I figured, you know, I know a lot of people had said to read that book on audio, and I read it in a physical copy and I loved it, so I decided to try this one out on audio, and I did really enjoy it. The audiobook production was really good. It had some nice commentary on there about sexism and classism and racism during the time of 50s, 60s, I mean even now, Hollywood and all of that, without like feeling too heavy-handed. This is definitely the story of Evelyn Hugo. I'm realizing right now pretty much all of the books that I read deal with very unlikable characters, so I don't think you're really supposed to like Evelyn. I feel like you're supposed to sympathize with her and understand what she's going through, but not necessarily like her. She does a lot of kind of shitty things, but a lot of shitty things happen to her too. I don't think this is a secret or a spoiler, so I'm just gonna say it, but Evelyn Hugo is a bi woman, so kind of talking about that identity, and she's also Cuban, but she kind of hides that and changes her name to get into Hollywood and to get those starring roles. So it does talk a lot about that, about kind of having to come to terms with yourself, and just the experience that I feel like a lot of people might have had and a lot of people might still have of changing things about themselves to fit in and to not get persecuted, and dealing with the success of that and kind of like the guilt of erasing some part of your identity to give yourself a better life when really you shouldn't have to. This book just made me very wistful to like go to the movies, and this was the book that was the most contemporary and the most present day contemporary out of them all, and I mean, I think there's a reason for that. I have kind of been avoiding that because I just don't want to think about the real life right now, because then I kind of think of all the things that I could be doing right now instead of stuck at home, which is kind of wistful for me. And then the last book that I read this month, also on audio, which I recommend. It's The Way You Need to Listen to This one, no question, and that is Stay Sexy and Don't Get Murdered by Karen Kilgariff and Georgia Hardstark. They run the My Favorite Murder podcast, and this is their definitive how-to guide, and really just kind of talking about them getting to where they were and getting to like the podcast and their first inklings that they were going to be a murderino. I don't think you will like this book unless you have listened to the My Favorite Murder podcast for sure, and if you aren't like really invested. Like, I feel like you have to be like a hardcore murderino to be invested in this, because for the most part it is just kind of talking about how they got to where they were when they started the podcast. So unless you're super invested in them as personalities, you probably won't enjoy this. I'm a diehard murderino, so I really enjoyed it. An incredible audiobook too. They filmed separately in the studio, I think, for when they read like their different parts, but there were also clips from like live shows where they performed parts of the book in front of an audience, which just really made it feel like more personal and more like I was listening to an episode of their podcast rather than their book. But I thought it had some really relatable and really wonderful insight, especially like on their mental health sections were the ones that I really enjoyed the most. Really made me feel like I wasn't alone, and I really love them as people. They're really warm and genuine. I'm really happy that they have a book. Just be forewarned, this is like the most, I feel like, niche recommendation, because unless you listen to the podcast and love the podcast, you probably won't enjoy the book. But that was the last book that I read this month. And then just to go over the OWLS Magical Readathon, I did complete it. My career was a magic zoologist, so I'll just quickly go through all of the books that I had to read for that. So the first prompt was Care of Magical Creatures. Read a book that has a creature with a beak on the cover. And for that one, I read Sarah J. Maas's Crescent City. Next one was Charms Lumos Maxima, and that I read Smoke Gets in Your Eyes. The next prompt was Herbology, and that was read a book whose title starts with an M, and for that I did read Monstrous Volume 1. The Potions prompt was read a book under 150 pages, and that was The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. And then for the Animagus training, extra credit for arithmecy was read a book outside of your favorite genre, and for me that was Valentine. Then for the last extra credit prompt was Transfiguration, and that was read a book that has shapeshifting in it, and that was Circe by Madeline Miller. So I completed it. I can go on to the newts later on this summer, and that's gonna be the end of this wrap up. If you liked this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, leave a comment down below, subscribe for more content from me. I'll catch y'all later. Bye!